All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon for Food Waste, Food Rescue, and the Future of Our Planet. Right from the top, I want to acknowledge that this hour that we have together is going to fly. We're not going to be able to cover it all, but we hope to provide a high-level overview of some of the issues related to food waste and the environment, to tackle a few of your questions and to take note of all of them. So if there are any questions we don't cover this afternoon, we can connect with everybody afterwards and maybe explore them over the coming weeks through our social channels. So drop in any questions you have right in the chat box. Our team is monitoring and passing them along to me. So to get started, without further ado, I would like to welcome Chris Beling. She's a project engineer with the EPA. Maricela Escobar, a food justice organizer with GreenRoots. Paul Saluth, founder and CEO of Little Leaf Farms, and Adam Kahn, who's on our board of directors here at Lovin Spoonfuls and a partner at Foley Hoag practicing in environmental and energy law. We're going to drop all those bios into the chat. My name's Ashley Stanley. I'm the founder and executive director of Lovin Spoonfuls, and happy to welcome you all here. So today we'd like to get started with Chris Beling of the EPA, who's going to frame this conversation with a short presentation about the environmental impact of food waste. So Chris, we're going to go ahead and share the screen and take it away.
Great, thank you so much. So good afternoon, and thank you to Lovin Spoonfuls for inviting me to start off today's conversation, an introduction to wasted food, food waste, food rescue, and the future of our planet. I'm introducing today's panel with a short 101 presentation on food loss and waste in the United States. I know this may sound obvious, but food loss and waste is defined as food intended for human consumption, but not ultimately consumed by humans. Slide 2. The Environmental Protection Agency has been working on the issue of food loss and waste since the 1990s. And I met Ashley when she began her journey on what is now Lovin Spoonfuls, well before this issue was in the mainstream. Early on in my work, I often got the question, why does EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, care about food waste? Well, wasted food hits the triple bottom line: social, environmental, and economic impacts. Now, clearly, EPA's focus is the environment, but reducing and preventing food waste can increase food security, foster productivity and economic efficiency, promote resource and energy conservation, and address climate change. That's a lot to digest, excuse the pun, and each topic could be discussed at length. EPA does have a variety of tools that helps organizations evaluate their waste streams, calculate their greenhouse gas emissions of their practices with our waste reduction model. But the issue of wasted food cannot be tackled from an environmental perspective alone, and has aligned with the environmental issue with the social mission of hunger relief. Next slide, please. Now let's get to some data. Over 1/3 of the food produced in the United States is never eaten. Think about that. It's wasting the resources used to produce it and creating a myriad of environmental impacts. Food waste is the single most common material landfilled or incinerated in the United States, comprising between 20 and 25% of the trash we discard every day. Now think about it, 1/3 of our trash from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is incinerated, with the remaining being landfilled. The connection today is that food rescue organizations, including Lovin Spoonfuls, play a critical role in reducing this waste stream. This slide exemplifies that several federal agencies, my own, the EPA, the US Department of Agriculture, and the Food and Drug Administration are working together on this issue, but we literally need everyone to join, including food recovery organizations, industry, institutions, local and state governments, and frankly, you as a consumer, to join the efforts to reduce food waste. This is my mantra. Significant resources go into growing, processing, packaging, storing, and distributing food. And the most important action we can take is to reduce the environmental impacts of uneaten food, is to prevent that food from becoming waste in the first place. Next slide. So where does this surplus food come from? Well, given the size and the complexity of the food system, there's no single agreed upon comprehensive estimate. The literature includes multiple examples that together provide insights just into the magnitude and the distribution of US food loss and waste. Estimates include anywhere from 400 to 1,000 pounds per person per year, but the bottom line is it's equal to about 35% of the food supply. So we borrow a graphic from Reframe, the national not-for-profit working on ending food loss and waste across the US food systems. And you can see that food is wasted on farms and during the manufacturing process, about a third of the annual US food loss and waste. The next roughly third is from the consumer-facing businesses, think retail stores, grocery stores, restaurants, other food service establishments. But here's the takeaway. The final third of food loss and waste, and maybe even a little bit more because my math was not exactly correct, is from our homes. And that's where you can have an impact by simply being aware of the issue and the impact of this issue on the environment and looking to change your habits. It's also valuable to note that fruits, veggies, dairy, and eggs are the most frequently wasted food in the United States. Next slide, please. So now you're looking at the best known EPA graphic, EPA's food recovery hierarchy. And for those of you who may not have this in front of you, it's an inverted triangle with 6 layers denoting recovery options. And the top layer is the most preferred to manage food is source reduction. Don't make waste in the first place. So easy to say, so difficult to do. The second tier is feed hungry people, the basis of our conversation today, followed by feed the animals, industrial uses, think biofuels and anaerobic digestion with energy recovery. Another key strategy is composting true food waste, and the least preferred is landfill or waste to energy, which I have editorialized here with a big red X over it. The hierarchy was developed by us in the USDA in the 1990s to focus the discussion on the value of food recovery. In 2015, we had our first national goal to reduce food loss and waste by 50% by 2030, which is approaching very quickly. And that aligns with the US Sustainable Development Goals as well. The takeaway of the food recovery hierarchy, again, is to encourage prevention and keep food in the human food supply chain. The biggest impact is source reduction or reducing waste on the farm, industrial process, retail level, and our home. Remember, a third of food in the United States is generated by you and me, the consumer in our homes. So my call to action is to evaluate your habits in your homes and see where you can reduce wasted food. I know many of you are saying, I don't waste food, but I challenge you to take a closer look. I know despite my best efforts, I often find some interesting science experiments in the back of my fridge or my fruit and veggie drawer, or forgetting about leftovers. Remember, fruit, vegetables, dairies, and eggs are the most frequently wasted food in the US. Thinking about wasted food and the connection to climate change can be a challenge, but one worth taking on. Our last slide. I just want to highlight our website that has much more information, including a report that was just released last week, Farm to Kitchen, the environmental impacts of food waste. In the analysis, the resources attributed annual food loss and waste in the United States is the equivalent of energy and water to supply 50 million homes. Clearly, we need to conserve these wasted resources, and working towards reducing wasted food by organizations like Lovin Spoonfuls and the action you take in your own lives is one way to have a tangible impact. Again, the most important action we can take to reduce the environmental impacts of uneaten food is to prevent that food from becoming waste in the first place. I'm sharing my contact information, and please reach out to me with any questions, comments, or concerns. Thank you so much for the time.
Chris, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for putting that together. Thank you so much for sharing it. I've been doing this work now for 12 years, and that data continues to be jarring, eye-catching, and inspiring action as we move forward. So at Spoonfuls, we are intentionally using words like climate emergency as opposed to climate change in lots of places. We're doing it because when we hear emergency, we think action. But before that, most people need to feel a connection to the issues. And Chris, in the presentation just now, you talked a lot about how reducing food loss has a direct impact on people, planet, and the economy. That's that triple bottom line that we all keep talking about. And that's all true. The one thing we know is that folks are sometimes perhaps slower to act on climate issues because they view it as something maybe impacting polar bears, penguins, maybe not something that's happening in their own backyard. So I want to turn it to the panel here and get an idea from each of you. How do you or your businesses help folks relate to this issue and really help them to make it personal? Maricela, maybe we'll start with you.
That sounds good. Do you have a specific question, or should I just introduce myself?
Yeah, a brief introduction, and then let's talk a little bit about how does the work that you're doing in your organization make it personal to folks to understand what this is doing, not just to the planet, but perhaps their communities in their own backyard and how they can participate.
Thank you all for having me on the panel. I'm Maricela, and I've worked as the food justice organizer at GreenRoots. In my role, I manage a couple of growing spaces in the city of Chelsea. And for us, we have an open space, a cultural center that we create, and we invite folks to be part of that cultural center that connects people to where the food is growing. And so like in Chelsea, we have a lot of families who have a farming background. It's a largely immigrant city with a lot of Spanish speakers. And that immigrant city comes with a lot of knowledge from a lot of like Central American countries. And folks have that space to be able to share that knowledge with their children, their grandchildren, with their neighbors. So it's a space that's used collectively as a cultural center, in addition to producing the food that we do, that we grow, and all the food that we produce and grow there is directly distributed to the community at no cost.
That's incredible. So that community center really feels like a place where folks can come, they can understand not just where their food is coming from, but really the effects of that in their community and for themselves and their families. Yeah.
Yeah, and sharing that knowledge that they themselves have as as farmers who migrated to a city from rural spaces, and continuing to pass that knowledge of transferring the knowledge to the children, the grandchildren. It's like, okay, this is how we used to do it in my home country, and growing foods and growing, for example, beans, and this is how beans are grown. So to have a space that people can share that knowledge, and it's not just a story that is related, but it's a story that is related and seen in practice and how it's done. So it's a continuation of generational knowledge.
That's incredible. Food there's so much connection there, and those stories and traditions, it really, again, it makes it personal for folks to understand sort of the impact and the weight of what that food means, not just to themselves or their families, but the community at large. Thank you for sharing that. Paul, you are sitting in front of a massive greenhouse on the screen there. Talk to us a little bit about what this looks like for you, how you're running Little Leaf, how Little Leaf itself sort of brings these messages into folks' homes and in their lives, and how you want to make it personal to people.
Great. Well, and thank you, Ashley, for the great work that you're doing at Lovin Spoonful, and keep it up. So yes, it's a lot of greens behind a big greenhouse in my picture, but we're a very small player in the leafy green space. And so if we're going to tackle the food waste issue, I think you have to look at it from a structural standpoint. Right now, we have areas of food production that are highly concentrated here in the United States. And so for us, we compete in the leafy green space. So we're based in Massachusetts, so we cut and deliver our products within 24 hours. And then we're up against products that are grown literally over 3,000 miles away, grown in California, and then the wintertime, Yuma, Arizona. So it directly leads to food waste. So you have about 15 to 20 days shelf life on our product, assuming the cold chain is respected. And then at that point, it's not edible. So imagine, having this product being grown over 3,000 miles away and having it take 7 or 8 days to actually, before it gets into a store. So these kinds of structural issues, I think, are going to have to be tackled if you're really going to develop a more resilient food system. And so we're a local New England, Massachusetts-based company. And as I mentioned, everything, we cut and it's going to be in the store within 24 hours. So we're giving the retailers another 7 or 8 days to sell our product. And that directly relates to lower food waste. So I think that's a big one. And if you look at Massachusetts, we're only growing about 10% of the food that we consume in Massachusetts within Massachusetts. So we are highly dependent upon the rest of the country, and for that matter, the rest of the world, to feed the people. And that same stat also goes to New England as well. New England grows about 10% of the food that we eat. So we're a big believer in peri-urban agriculture, using controlled environment systems like what we're doing at Little Leaf. And we hope we're the beginning of many examples where we can build a more localized and resilient food system and move that 10% up to a significantly higher number. And I think a real direct benefit of that will be significantly reduced food waste and higher quality food for the consumer.
Paul, thanks. I can personally say that Little Leaf is my favorite, and anytime I get to see it in the store, know where it's coming from. I think it does help me as a consumer see sort of the local significance of what it means to be in a functioning local food system, and then the additional benefits that come out of that. So thank you for your work, and thank you for the great lettuce. Adam, you and I have been working together now for a few years, and you sort of have a different perspective on all of this coming from the legal space. What are your thoughts about some of the things that we're talking about, and where is it that you come into sort of the intersection of the legality around food production, environmental law, and then the work that we're doing at Spoonfuls?
Thanks, Ashley. There's a big disconnect, I'm afraid to say, between advocates of food rescue and an understanding of the environmental impacts of food rescue. Chris's presentation covered some of this, but when food is wasted, I should say this, the primary reason for rescuing food, in my view, is to feed people. And I think for many people, that's as far as you need to go in terms of thinking about what you need to act. But there is a huge environmental component as well. And some of it is sort of obvious and right in front of you. If you throw out your food waste, it goes to some place where it's either burned or buried, maybe composted, but even that has its own issues. And you see that, and obviously that's an impact that we want to avoid. But what we don't see when you do that is the upstream impacts. How much energy did it take to get that food to your kitchen? How much water was used? How much land was deforested? You can go on forever with a list like that. So I think about food rescue as, well, the environment as one of 1,000 reasons why food rescue is important. I find that when I discuss the environmental impacts, I have to say that some people understand and some people are, in the process of understanding. But one thing that could really help for food rescue is for people to really believe in their hearts that climate change is happening, and it's happening now, and that even an individual has some ability to control that. There's individual contributions. It's very hard. It's very easy to visualize the benefits of not wasting food that's in your kitchen. It's much harder to realize on a worldwide scale that if everybody did this, it would start to make a huge difference. So that's probably what I would say about that.
That makes so much sense. And thanks for connecting the dots there. And Adam, you bring up something really important, right? And this is sort of the heart of, I think, what we try to talk about at Spoonfuls, but I think everybody who's on this panel experiences in one way or another that food is sort of the central connector. And then from there, how do we create the connective tissue to all of the different things that are happening as a result of growing food, producing food, and then distributing food, and the transportation consequences that you just mentioned. And I think Paul or Mary, this might be something that you both could contribute to and talk about the climate impact or the impact on transportation in terms of supporting Massachusetts growers?
Yeah, well, I'll take a first crack at that. I mean, we're located in Devens, Mass, and we're about 42 miles from Boston. So one of the reasons why we located there, they have their own microgrid. They have a significant amount of photovoltaic on-site capability, which is part of that microgrid. And so for us, having a ability to get electricity that's carbon free is obviously a big part of fighting climate change. And then of course, being close to the market, as I talked earlier, is a really important secondary goal. But we're looking at it from a broader perspective of sustainability as well. And we get, one of the few complaints we get is the plastic packaging we use. And, it's interesting. We've tried to be as green post-consumer recycled PET plastic. So we kind of view we're part of the solution, not part of the problem. But nevertheless, it's an issue that we look at, and that's just an example of a lot of other issues around sustainability that we care really deeply about, right? From capturing the rain that falls on a roof for our primary source of irrigation, from using, biological control, other insects to control pests in our greenhouse. All of those things all add up and are, part of what make our product very high quality, but also contribute to the fact that we care about the climate and want to reduce our carbon emissions as well.
Paul, thanks for that. Mari, what about you in terms of transportation, distribution, and how that affects growers in Massachusetts?
Yeah, totally. Thanks for sharing that, Paul. So like I want to share just a little background about myself. Like I grew up on a subsistence farm as a child. So it was like a very close loop food system that my grandparents had on the farm. And so you could imagine like a couple of acres that's being under production, growing corns, beans, sorghum. And we had animals, your typical animals, horses, cows, dogs, and cats. And that system in that small town, it was a very close loop system. So you didn't have as much waste. You still had like a tiny little bit of waste, but not as much as what we see today, right? In this large system, right, from production, as Chris was showing on the PowerPoint presentation, from the start of inception to creating a surplus of produce that there's not a market for in some cases, to the post-consumer consumption and the loss of that, the creation of waste. And you see for like in Chelsea and Everett, certain parts of those two cities, these cities are very industrial, and that's where a large amount of the produce comes through for New England at large. So you have this area that's very concentrated in the amount of transportation that goes through it from 18-wheelers on our roads in Chelsea, constantly going at it. From like oil to actual produce that's being transported. And people work in these places. Like I have family members who have worked in these companies, whether it's like packaging greens or some form of produce. And you see how, we have just like a very concentrated system in that model, and a system that, it takes up a lot of energy, as Adam and Paul and Chris have been mentioning, to run the system in so many ways. So to have like a more local food system, right? Like to have local farms in spaces that allow for you to grow produce, right? And to allow for agricultural usage of land that, up until like recently, for example, like in the last decade or so, the city of Boston didn't allow for the legal commercialization of farms, and to have those laws be changed with the community input, and to have like a more local farm where people are connected to that food it definitely cuts so many middlemen in the process. And to have that, like when community, and it creates stronger communities. In the case for like Chelsea, when we have that small little urban farm, ours is not a big farm. It's like very small. It's probably the size of your, somebody's house, your average American typical household. And that space, to have that connection and of people coming through and being able to harvest that carrot, that cabbage, and people, and for us, people they say what they want to see grown in that space. So like, we don't grow like kale or like collard greens, but we do grow like cabbages, carrots. People tell us what they want to see grown in that space. And for people to put that input, to say, hey, this is what we want to see grown here, and to listen to what they want to see grown, you're going to have like a more success rate of people taking that produce, going home. And when they come on site to pick it up, to say, this is actually what I want. And many people come through and they're like, I actually don't need that much of this. I only need a certain amount of this. And that is like a really, for me, like a really beautiful example of like when you have a local farm and people can connect to, and that really reduces, that transportation usage, that usage of other chemicals or pesticide, insecticides, to kind of to preserve, the product that you want to bring out to a market that's like, as Paul was saying, like a large part of our produce comes from when it's in season and from California, and it's shipped across the whole country. And so like having that local farm food system is a really a key part in our food system to try to reduce that transportation, to mitigate the issues with transportation of food.
Mari, thanks for that. So much of what you just said made me think about many of the conversations we have at Spoonfuls all the time about the sort of evolution of the language around food and the growing of food, and how some of those words have ended up with their value as menu designators, right? Like sustainably sourced vegetables on the side of your plate, or local organic product that is on special. But when you really look at it in an intentional way, what that does is truly create a functioning food system that serves its community and its community needs in an intentional and important way. Chris, I'm wondering if you have sort of a bird's eye view of all of these different things, and how did the EPA see all of these different connections in terms of the different offsets from this food production and then transportation?
A couple of things came to mind. First off, Adam was totally spot on in terms of it's of the upstream, right? And Mari said the same thing. So, that's like I said, my mantra. My mantra is don't make food waste in the first place. And, local food system that Paul's supporting exactly helps us do that. And that was certainly highlighted during COVID, right? And we realized the supply chain issues. The one other thing I wanted to come to Paul's defense on, though, is the packaging. Everyone thinks like, oh, plastic packaging bad. You know what? If that plastic packaging can keep food wholesome for another 10 days, I'll take the plastic packaging versus the food waste. So, there's these life cycle costs that are very subtle, and I think very complicated when you start delving into the issues. So the takeaway again is don't make food waste in the first place, but there's subtleties that wonks like you and I, Ashley, can talk about. But I think the general consumer might just, not live in that world.
That's a great point, Chris. And I think if we think about it, if we think about the single sort of largest product type that winds up in landfills is not plastic, it is food. Right. And so I think when we're looking at how do we sort of look at conserving supply and what does that look like in a holistic way, I think you make a good point. Adam, I see a question just came in for you here. Can food rescue directly impact upstream environmental issues, or does the food rescue use one problem to solve another, perhaps bringing awareness to the upstream issues. Again, we're talking about that sort of intersection of all of these different, costs and benefits of this work.
So it's a good question. And I would say that if you throw out something that would otherwise be food, that does not directly and instantaneously cause a farmer to do something. But if 25 million people decided that we're going to eat all of our lettuce, to go back to Paul, so we're not, the people are eating more lettuce and losing less. If you take the opposite of that and say people are throwing out the lettuce right and left, then Paul's got to grow more lettuce in order to meet that supply. And so the environmental impacts of Paul's operations will increase. And this is true, I think, on any kind of a scale, but particularly with, the food production cycle is now very international, and the impacts can be felt much more on new farmland or with very energy intensive operations. In terms of bringing awareness to the upstream issues, talks like this can help bring attention to the upstream issues. Again, when food is rescued, I don't think the primary reason to do it is environmental. It's just being aware that if you don't waste something now, you'll have a beneficial impact on the environment later through collective action.
And I love that synergy too. And that's what I was trying to get at, Ashley. Like, I would never have met you in my role of a waste person at EPA, right? But the synergies have been really fantastic in the food recovery space. And many people might know we have landfill bans in Massachusetts, Vermont, Rhode Island, Connecticut for food waste diversion. We're 4 states out of 6 in the country that have these, might be a little bit more now, but New England were the leaders. And I know in Vermont, they had a very clear distinction. When people started not being able to put food waste in the landfill, their food donation numbers went up, right? And then unfortunately, maybe their food donation numbers went down once they started seeing, wow, why am I donating this much? So right. Ashley and I have had conversations about her putting herself out of business, but I don't think you'll ever be put out of business just based on our culture. But
right. And I think you make a good point. And I think the idea here is how do we, and we've been talking about this for years, how do we reframe our approach to food in general? How do we reframe the way we value food in general, right? If we're valuing food differently, we're valuing community differently, we're valuing people differently. And what does that look like as it relates to food waste? Do I think that there is room to move into perhaps a non-urgent response supply chain role that does not require sort of the urgency of the kind of hunger relief that's necessary now? Perhaps, which is bringing me to sort of my next question for everybody here, but overall, I think the idea of looking at food needing to find its highest value. And Adam, you've talked about this, Chris, you've talked about this, Paul, you're talking about this in terms of your packaging and how do we keep this food better and safer for longer. And then Mary, with the work you do, I think this is really all about keeping food at its highest value, which is ultimately to feed people. And that brings in the questions of the value of composting, the value of AD, things like that. But yes, we did see donations dip a little bit, and that was okay. I think the idea here is, again, to keep the food feeding folks. One of the things though, and I think just before we got talking about this, COVID came up as it does these days pretty regularly. As we talk about the ways that COVID has really put a spotlight on communities that are disproportionately affected by general social norms. Climate change is something that's disproportionately affecting BIPOC and low-income communities, already hard hit by public health crises, hunger, COVID, what have you. In your views, how is that playing out here in Massachusetts? Everybody's working in a bit of a different place on the field, if you will. So I'm particularly interested to hear everybody's perspective here. Mary, you want to start with that? We were talking about Chelsea, Everett. Those are some of the communities that were really hit hardest. I know we saw an uptick of need for our partners there, and that's really where I think you guys are seeing most of your work.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, the pandemic really hit Chelsea in a really strong way, in a really heartfelt way, and not just the number of cases during the peak of the pandemic, but also like in the way that a lot of people were one paycheck away from paying rent, from paying food. So it was a multifold, right? It's not just a story of people, when people lose their jobs, they're not able to pay the rent, pay for food. And we saw in Chelsea that it was like a lot of multiple factors impacting that situation, and people were really hard hit by the pandemic. And so we saw a rise in need for food in our community. People were lining up for blocks and blocks, and they still are, to be able to receive food, because they're not able to buy it themselves at the store. Because even to this day, some people haven't fully been able to return to their pre-pandemic jobs, or those jobs no longer exist. And these issues are interrelated, to how, like past, we can't remove the current situation from the past. So it's very influenced what has happened in the past. So like in terms, like I think sometimes in relating to climate justice, how we think about Chelsea as a community, and it's a very highly industrial city, and it's been created that way, deliberately been created that way, by state laws, that allow for a highly industrialization along the Chelsea Creek, for example. So when you have laws in place that allow for industrialization in a certain way, the community can't be like, okay, there's like less power in the community to say, we actually would like to see this community used in a different way. And oftentimes people who have been historically marginalized are pushed into communities that are more heavily industrialized, and have more environmental impacts that impact their health surrounding them. And for the case in Chelsea, is for like that instance of like having like a highly concentrated amount of like trucks coming in and out. That's like one instance. And like that's like a particular design of Chelsea that was created, and how we move forward in thinking about, like when we think about climate justice, and thinking about, what does that look like as far as like, addressing these issues in our communities, specifically that address like heavily concentration of like pollution and environmental health issues. And when they're like added to pandemic, right, like we saw with COVID, like health issues that were already exacerbated, right? I'm not a scientist, so I can't say, there was a direct link, but, common sense and common knowledge would say that there's a link between other environmental pollutants that were already there, or environmental societal health issues already there. And then you have the COVID hitting the Chelsea community at a higher rate disproportionately. So all those things are interconnected and create like a community that, is heavily impacted when things like COVID come up.
Thank you for that insight, Mari. That's so helpful, and so much to think about. I think that doesn't always come to the surface when we're talking about these things, and we don't always go in to understand sort of the true nuances. Paul, I know you say you're a small player, you're also a large grower compared to some. So I'm sure that these are things that you all are thinking about at Little Leaf.
Yeah. So, COVID has been interesting to make an understatement about how, what it's been like to run a business. So, we're deemed essential as a food producer, and like a lot of companies that are in the food space, we had to run through COVID and just protect our employees and do all the things you needed to do, but to make sure that our responsibility as a food producer was still ongoing. So what we're finding now is that we're still not out of this whole area, this whole issue, right? There's a real sort of shortage of truck drivers right now in our country, which actually it's exacerbating the West Coast guys, so it's actually something that is not hurting me per se, because obviously we're local, and we're going to Tewksbury, we're going to Freetown, we're going to Cheshire, Connecticut, we're going to Springfield, Mass. I mean, those are our routes because we're servicing our customers that all have distribution centers there. So I am just such a big proponent of basically what I call peri-urban agriculture, which is returning the suburbs right back to their traditional role of feeding the cities, which was the case prior to World War II. It's not going to happen in the same way as the way it was pre-World War II. You're going to need high-tech facilities like what we're doing at Little Leaf Farms. And yes, we're a big grower for Massachusetts, but we're still a relatively small grower compared to the Goliaths out in California. So I want more people to do what we're doing and move that 10% number up higher. And I think that's going to have a direct effect on reduced food waste and lower carbon emissions to avoid all that cross-country transportation.
That makes a lot of sense, Paul, and things are indeed different. Our population is up exponentially and only continuing to grow at that rate. And there's so much discussion about growing food sort of commensurate to that number. And I think that's why this conversation is so important, to make sure that we're conserving our food supply as the population continues to grow, and that we can properly allocate and understand who needs what. And Paul, to your point, where. As we're winding down here, not quite there, I want to make sure though we address sort of the large piece of all of these conversations, which is, where does change get made, and how do we see sort of some of these larger influences happening? And particularly Adam and Chris, I'm wondering if there are any pieces of policy or legislation that you both are watching that either we should be aware of as the general public, as consumers, because at the end of the day, it really comes down to, how does this policy influence what happens on the ground, and how can our behavior help support any of that we should be watching?
Adam, do you want to talk local, or do you want me to start? Tell me what you want.
You can start and I'll follow up.
Okay. So I work on the federal level, and there's some very key pieces of legislation on the federal level that really impact things, like the Bill Amerson Act, Ashley, that talks about, no liabilities if you are donating food. So there's some very good policies that we already have in this country. What I alluded to before is really, I work in the 6 New England states. That's how EPA is organized. And we have some really great state policies here, which are called diversion bans, where if you're a generator like a supermarket and you generate more than X number of tons a week, you must not put that in your trash. And there's subtleties on these regulations. And like I said, Vermont has laws, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey. You're thinking about where those laws are, and then California. I think Maryland too. I'm not sure I got every one of the states that's working on that policy, but that
the Massachusetts ban came, pardon me for interrupting, 2014. Am I correct?
Yeah, and like I said, the 4 New England states were the first 4 in the country, all around 2014, with Massachusetts being one of the very first. And Vermont's actually goes down to the consumer level. You can't throw out food waste in your house. Massachusetts really sticks to the bigger generators, and they are now proposing to reduce that size to bring in more people into that pie, right, Ashley? It used to be 1,000 pounds a week. Now I think it's going to be 5,000 pounds a week.
Yes.
Excuse me, 500 pounds a week.
500. Yeah.
So, you're really seeing some of these policies really take effect, also growing in other parts of the country, and then changing and being I can't say the word, but I'm trying to think it.
Efficacious.
Thank you. In the States. And like I said, Massachusetts now has anaerobic digestion capacity I never thought we'd have. It's amazing. Food waste is kind of fought over, right, Ashley? I mean, there's a demand.
And it comes back to sort of the value, right? It really, that hierarchy logo is or should be the fundamental for anybody getting into any kind of work around food. It's such a tremendous guide to understand value. And I think there's some conversation here from what I can see in the chat box and just some general conversation that was always happening, even when Spoonfuls began, around sort of, well, I already compost, so I'm all set. And they're not mutually exclusive, right? We really want to bring that conversation back to the value of food. And if it can be fed, if it has retained its, post-marketable, saleable value, it doesn't look perhaps like what it should, but all of its nutrients there, everything is working as it should, that should be fed to humans.
Right. And I always want to make sure that it's wasted food, right? I'm never, ever, ever, ever talking about feeding anyone food waste. It's food that is surplus, food that has its value, food that's wholesome and has the nutrition. So, and I did make a comment, the composting is great. Like you said, it's at the bottom of the triangle. We need composting, we need soils, but it should be for really, really true food waste, not food waste, food that is edible and has a bigger purpose.
And then quickly, before we kick it to Adam for his expert opinion on this, what is sort of the EPA's general reaction to the ban? We were one of the first. It has been a good 6 or 7 years now. I think we certainly saw it, be implemented. Some of the execution took a few years. Were you and the EPA happy with how it has gone?
So me and the EPA could be two different things.
Good point.
But I think in general, honestly, in even the Obama administration, the Trump administration, now the Biden administration, food waste has always been a hot topic.
Yeah.
And I'm very grateful for that because it is so ubiquitous. Yeah. And it's so, it's a win-win, right? It's a win-win. I will say our states have been leaders, and I really admire that. The other thing, it's funny, if you follow policy, EPA is putting out these strategies, and the next one is on organics management and how we can move the needle to meet that goal, right? Reduce food waste by 50% by 2030. 2030 is not very far away. And I don't believe we're anywhere near that goal.
I would agree. And population is set to again, just continue to skyrocket in relation to that. Adam, policies.
Well, first, I think I'll second everything that Chris said. For me, one of the more important comments was that the food waste bans, which it's in the Northeast. I think it's also in California and New York City and Minneapolis and Austin, Texas. I might be missing some. I think it's great. But those bans, those regulations do not really differentiate between organic waste and food waste. There's no particular incentive to, I don't think it creates an incentive to save food. What it does is reduce the impact of wasted food that needs to be dealt with. I like to think about some of the incentives that our regulatory system can provide. And I think mostly in this case about large retailers, that the states that have food waste bans that apply, it's terrific. But if there was also some tax benefit more tax benefit rather for donating food to create a better labeling system. Because if the labels could more accurately reflect what the true lifespan of food is, then I think there would be less food wasted, because there's a ton of food that's thrown out just because it's one day past its sell-by date, even if it's going to be good for another week.
So on target, Adam. That is such an on target comment.
And Adam, would you just go through just really quickly the as best you can, and certainly we can all support that, but use by, sell by, expiration, they're all marketing terms. They're not speaking to the goodness of that food.
Or food safety, right?
Food safety.
Well, I think that's basically it. There's multiple methods to determine the end of the sell-by date, which I think is the sell-by date is the one that's very important in its relationship to the last day that food is still food. So there's different styles. I like the idea. There might be a sell-by date that allows a few days for the food that's purchased to be consumed. That we see that sometimes. We can also change it to have a used by date, and then the consumer can decide, will I be able to use it then? I mean, I think there's a lot of different variants on how to make the labeling more conducive to saving that food as opposed to throwing it out while it is still food. I wanted to mention one other policy or practice that I'm starting to watch now, and this is on a global scale. There's annually there's a meeting of representatives of many countries about climate. COP26 just finished. That was in Glasgow, and there's a big one. Before that, the Paris Accords. The Paris Accords really didn't deal with food waste. I mean, I don't know why, because food waste, something that's always brought out is if food waste was a country, it would be just after China and just before India in terms of there's a million expressions like that. So it was odd to me that it wasn't really a focus. In COP26, we're starting to see some focus there, which should filter down to actionable policies and legislations soon. I don't know that it's possible for an individual consumer to feel those effects, but by prioritizing on a world scale, avoiding food waste, a lot of that in COP26 is to avoid methane emissions that are, the methane emissions from cows are just immense, and methane is 25 times stronger a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So the efforts that I think will come from that will pay long-term benefits.
I think we can all agree there. It's funny because Chris, when we started this conversation, food waste, food recovery, and what that looks like and the actions around it weren't discussed in sort of the mainstream conversation that they were 10, 12 years ago that they are now. And there's still so much to be done when you get into the specific actionable efforts that we can make either as individuals or as much larger global corporations to really understand the nuances of what those offshoots are. Chris, did I interrupt you? Were you about to?
No, I just totally agree with everything Adam and you both said. I mean, the UN does have some sustainability goals, so that's good. They're reducing food loss and waste by 2030, so that's on a global scale, but I couldn't agree with you more. And some of it's just how we've framed the climate conversation. It's always been transportation and energy, right? And I think we have to broaden that thinking and those nuances. And it's happening, Ashley, but it's
slow.
happening, you know, it's slow.
Most of this, right, what we're talking about, any kind of social change, social effort, we all know from our own seats where we are working on these collective efforts. It takes some time, but we're in the work to sort of think about how to end this. And to that point, I'd love everyone to offer a call to action. And that can be to your customer, to your community, to your client, to a much larger community. And I think what we'll take from this is really seeing how different these calls to action might be, but they're all dealing with the same sort of central effort in terms of climate emergency, specifically focused in food. Mari, should we start with you? What do you have for us?
Oh my God. On the advice column. Well, you know, when I think about food systems and how they were created and how large they are, like I feel like a little speckle in the dust because it's immense. And so there are many ways to be involved as an individual. And also when I think of like collective action and political will, that takes a lot of like more community orientation to do that. So my suggestion is to, you know, look out for like specific political actions that can impact the food system. Like for instance, for us, you know, like in Chelsea, like we could definitely have a greater impact in like having more land, you know, but the issue of accessing land in Chelsea is like, it's a skyrocketing price, you know, to be able to afford, to be able to lease, to be able to do that. And also thinking about like that the soils are heavily contaminated too. So thinking about like, how is that space used? How, you know, like, and being involved in the community, in the government level and politically, to have a say, you know, when things come up, how to use a community space to be involved in that.
That's great. Thank you. Paul.
Well, to me, the call to action is more, surprise, surprise, more localized food production.
Yep.
You got to drive up this 10%. That's just way too low. But I also think, you know, with the climate crisis, and as Adam was talking about the recent Glasgow event, and it seems now we've got policy at the federal level that is going to incentivize actions towards better climate policies. I think that localized food production needs to come with real sustainability metrics, you know, carbon footprint, all of that. It's very important. It's not one or the other. It's really both. And that's my call to action.
Thanks, Paul. Strong one. Chris, I'm just going now. You're all in on my Zoom board.
You know, wearing my federal policy hat or EPA, there are many organizations out there that have asked EPA to do exactly what you're asking, is a campaign to make this issue more mainstream. That seems to be ReFed has asked that. The Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic has asked EPA for that. And I think that might come out. We have a program called Food Too Good to Waste, you know, just talking about this issue on a very granular level. You know, what you do in your home. Do you make a shopping list? You know, do you shop your fridge? Just the awareness of this issue in the general public, I think, is a very good first step. So my call to action is don't make food waste in the first place. And if you do make food, you know, donate it from the second place. But the real call to action is to just to spread this word, because I don't think this is getting in the mainstream, Ashley, but I don't think it's there yet.
I'm with you on that, Chris. Thank you. Adam.
So my day job is that I represent regulated entities when they have a problem or an issue, or there's a benefit from interacting with a regulator or regulatory system. So this doesn't particularly pertain to individuals, but if the right incentives are in place, the right economic incentives, by statute, some things will require federal regulation, some things are just policy. But we talked about before, more flexibility in labeling, tax benefits, liability protection. All of these are incentives if they can be, placed in the law, then they will be used. I think the liability protection is already in place, but there's talk about doing what I would call better ones are in some of the other states. I'd also, so I want to think about carrots because I also think there can be more sticks. If we could provide some benefits and make more specific the obligations of waste generators in a way that is practical, right? I mean, we have to, if you really can't put together a regulation or a law that can never be implemented. But for one example is compost came up in the chat as a great place to take food waste. Well, that's true up to the scale that it can be taken, which is a very, at the moment without just the compost pile, that would only cover a small, very small percentage, probably, less than 1% of the food waste that needs to be handled.
Yeah.
So if we create, so there's no good way to throw it out. So I think at this point, creating incentives, and then also for retailers and manufacturers to require the more sensible labeling, to create incentives for a retail establishment to save food that is aging and make sure it either gets sold or eaten. All of these can happen, and that can make a big difference elsewhere. So my call to action would be for governments to exercise the authority that they have, or to get new authority to hit food waste head on.
Adam, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who joined us, for our guests today, Chris, Paul, Mary, Adam, thank you all so much for joining us. Mary, I'm going to echo you here, and not that anyone's asking me, but I would say vote and inform your vote. Political will is where some of these things start and where they can be solved. So I want to thank all of our panelists for their insights, for their contributions to the work that we're all trying to do. I wish everybody a good holiday season, and thanks for being with us.
Great.
Keep in touch.
Thank
so
you.
much.